Joining me live on the broadcast is WION's correspondent in Washington, D.C., Nina Maria Potts. Nina, good evening. Thanks for joining us here on the conversation. President Trump, fairly cogent there in his complete takedown of Iran and what he thinks of the Iranian nuclear deal. But how divided is Congress on the nuclear deal, and what sort of impact will that have on going through with some of the things that he said today?
Well, as you know, Congress has 60 days now to review this decertification of the Iran nuclear deal that President Trump has signaled that he is doing. He's decertifying the deal. I think he's gone a step further, perhaps, than we expected him to, in saying that if Congress can't reach the conclusion that he's looking for, which is essentially to toughen the deal and reimpose sanctions, then he has the right, as the sitting president, essentially to terminate the deal entirely. But the buck is really now passed to Congress for the immediate future. And your question about bipartisan support for taking this deal apart, the Democrats are very much against President Trump's perceived rhetoric on Iran. They think that he's upping the ante, that he's being far too aggressive and combative and not really thinking through the consequences. However, there are Iran hawks. And even, by the way, among some of the US's key allies, we're hearing reports that even within the British government, there's a kind of understanding that's sympathetic to the view that the US, by toughening its rhetoric and language on Iran, is yielding results, that there is a discussion underway now that by toughening the stance on Iran, that Iran will be forced to play ball. I think what's not clear is whether or not there is a better deal to be had. And of course, that debate will be played out on Capitol Hill among US lawmakers over the coming days.
Absolutely. But it's not the Democrats alone, right, Nina? I mean, aren't the Republicans too split in how they perceive the Iranian nuclear deal as it stands right now?
Yeah, that's very much the case even within the Trump administration. And we've heard U.S. Secretary of Defense General Mattis talk to Congress and defend the existing international deal on Iran, saying that if it was to be unraveled, that would be a direct threat to America's national and security interests. So even within the cabinet, there's a split, I think, on what to do next on Iran, with some of President Trump's closest advisors seeking to rein him in. So that divide among Republicans isn't just true of lawmakers. It's also within the White House itself. It's been a very heated debate. I would just say that technically, as sitting U.S. president, under the terms of the U.S. participation in the Iran deal, has to certify the deal every 90 days. So President Trump has already certified the deal twice since coming into office. He has been telling his advisors for some weeks that he was not prepared to certify it again. So that has led to this measure, this action today.
Absolutely. Just looking at some of the other policies that he's been completely against, Nina, there was the relationship between the United States and Cuba, Obamacare, NAFTA, DACA, and now this, of course. And for some people sitting in South Asia who are viewing this without an understanding of the intricacies of American policy, it would seem almost as if President Trump is going hammer and tongs on everything associated with President Obama's legacy.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, I think partly what drives him is an attempt to take apart the signature sort of legacies left by President Obama. This is a deliberate attempt to dismantle it. He kept saying again and again something that he has said all along, even going back to the campaign trail, that this was a bad deal for America, a terrible deal for America. This was a deal that was unfair to America. So a definite swipe at President Obama, his predecessor. There is a strain of thought that says that President Trump, having been extremely tough on the rhetoric, has actually listened to some of his advisors on Iran and some of those other key pieces of legislation that you mentioned, and appeared much tougher than he has been in the actual final act. And there may be some truth to that he has essentially undermined and derailed some of this legislation, but not been able to kick the boot in when the moment finally came.
Absolutely. Stay with me, Nina. We also heard the Iranian parliament speaker say earlier today that Washington's withdrawal from the nuclear deal would be an insult to the United Nations. Let's listen into exactly what that statement was.
متاسفانه آمریکا در شرایطی قرار گرفته با این گونه حرف‌ها جایگاه خودش رو کاملا تنزل داده.
Конечно, они делают свой статус более нестабильным.
توافق هسته‌ای مسئله دو جانبه نیست.
Ядерного соглашения, то это не двустороннее
соглашение. توسط قطعنامه شورای امنیت.
Оно закреплено резолюцией Совета Безопасности ООН. Поэтому это оскорбление в адрес ООН. Но для всего этого есть у нас четкий и ясный ответ.
All right, WION's correspondent Nina Maria Potts still with us on the broadcast. All right, let me go across to Nina first. Nina, starting with, of course, the comments that President Trump made about Iran's past and the aggressions towards the United States. What do you make of him driving home that point of Iran being a sponsor of terror?
Well, it was a fairly damning list, a real indictment of Iran's positioning in the region and its activities. President Trump talked about a complete overhaul of U.S. policy against Iran. He described Iran as a rogue regime. He said Iran was controlled by a fanatical regime. He said the U.S. plans to take several steps to confront Iran's activities. He accused Iran of spreading death and destruction around the globe. He pointed to the past. I mean, he built quite a sort of strong historical case against Iran. He pointed to the Iran hostage crisis, talked about Iranian support, alleged Iranian support for bombings that had involved American citizens. He pointed to the attack in Beirut in the 80s and said very clearly that Iran continues to this day to be a state sponsor of terror. And that really sort of led to his to the moment when he declared that he was decertifying the Iran deal, having built, I'd say, a pretty powerful but fairly damning picture of Iran's intentions and its alleged role in stoking civil wars in the region.
Stay with me, Nina. My colleague Maral is joining in on the broadcast from Tehran. Maral, not a withdrawal, but a decertification, but enough still, though, to attract a strong response from Iran.
Yes, certainly. Good evening to you. Well, basically, this act by Trump appears to be both designed to somehow halt Iran's activities and development, and also to provoke Iran to take measures in retaliation, which will be then perceived as a form of violation of Iran deal. This way, Iran will be the first party to violate the deal. For instance, Iran may reinvigorate its nuclear program, or RGC may take military actions against U.S. forces in the region. So, and it severely will impact Iran's economy, because IRGC is a major economic force in Iran with hundreds of thousands of subsidiary companies which conduct business in all areas, from construction to film industry. And now that IRGC is listed as a terrorist group, I think it will also be some sort of a soft sanction already imposed on the country, because foreign companies will be even more wary of conducting business with Iran, fearing that they may unknowingly be getting involved with companies associated with IRGC.
And Nina, we've spoken with, pardon me, Maral, if I could ask you that question. I was speaking with Nina about, what exactly this means for America. But even for Iran, what exactly does this deal mean for Hassan Rouhani? He's just won a re-election. And looking at domestic policy, this question is for Maral.
Well, you see, of course, some hardliners in Iran, they've been, sabotaging the deal as well as we see that some Democrats do it in Washington. But what's happening, I think, within the past weeks, we've witnessed that the Iranian government has showed solidarity with the IRGC, and the same thing will happen. I think this will bring different parts of the Iranian regime, which otherwise we'd have severe differences together, and we shall wait and see what will happen next, because I think the first statements and comments will come from IRGC, and then the Rouhani government would definitely submit to what other parts of the regime will define in terms of domestic and international policy.
All right, Nina, what do you make of President Trump's stance on the IRGC?
Well, I think there's a big picture takeaway from President Trump's announcement today, and that is that in passing the buck to Congress, essentially what he's achieved is a compromise, a temporary reprieve, which gives President Trump just a little bit of time. I think, of course, waiving the threat that if Congress doesn't do exactly what he expects Congress to do, that he has the right to kill and sink the Iran deal altogether, ultimately serves to undermine the deal from the get-go. There are two scenarios on Congress, on Capitol Hill, in the debate to come over the next 60 days. One is that they reimpose snapback sanctions on Iran, and the Iran deal starts to unravel and come apart. There's also a second scenario in which they could actually strengthen the Iran deal, and there are different ways that they can do that. But what was very clear from President Trump's speech just now was that he plans to pursue what he hopes will amount to a unilateral or even bilateral move on Iran, which is essentially to introduce fresh sanctions through new legislation. Triggers. There are triggers that would bring those sanctions to fruition. He wants additional sanctions, financing, and to stop its weapons development, and he was very clear about that. That new legislation and how it takes shape remains to be seen. But regardless of whether or not he is essentially trying to unpick the deal now, which he can't because he's put that in the hands of Congress, the reality is that he has totally undermined the deal and sown the seeds of discord between the US and its international allies, especially the Europeans, who, if you remember, were absolutely critical to negotiating the deal with Iran way back at a time when the US wasn't speaking to Iran. The Europeans did all of the shuttling, the diplomatic shuttling between European capitals and Tehran, and really brought all sides together.
Is it ironic, Nina, that what you're referring to, of course, and what everyone's referring to is the fact that this seems like a short-term fix that President Trump has proposed, and that's the problem he has with the deal with Iran to start with. He says that it isn't a long-term picture, but what he's proposing doesn't seem to be either.
Yeah, there is a certain inherent irony to that. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's also the technical construct around the Iran deal and the U.S.'s participation in it, in that the U.S. president, this was born from Capitol Hill. This is a requirement of Congress. The U.S. president has to certify the deal every 90 days. And part of the debate within the White House has been centered around that, the kind of reality check that President Trump would have to continue to certify it every 90 days, certify a deal that he doesn't believe in and certify a deal that he doesn't approve of and wants to see, annihilated, essentially. So that's one of the technical problems that the White House is now facing if Congress doesn't act to start unpicking it all together.
Absolutely, Maral, but there must be a certain degree of relief, let's say, the fact that President Trump has sort of passed the buck on to Congress, that he hasn't withdrawn entirely from the deal, and the fact that European partners and signatories to the deal, including and Russia, of course, have been very vocal about the fact that they want the deal to stay.
Well, certainly, but he also concluded by saying that if they cannot come to agreement with Congress and their allies, then they will basically repeal Iran's deal. And as you know, Iran deal is not a unilateral deal between Iran and the US, and it has become a United Nations Security Council resolution. And there was basically a process for dispute resolution. And according to that, any party dissatisfied with the developments could have referred to Joint Commission or what's called the Dispute Resolution Commission, and then the matters would, take their course. So the fact that US has United States and specifically President Trump has basically tossed it back to Congress, it just shows that he wants to transmit responsibility and liability of sabotaging the deal to Congress to avoid consequences of such decision may have on an international level. But nonetheless, it stays, and I think the impact that it will have on Iran's domestic policy, now the IRGC is basically, and all of its agents and allies are basically not only sanctioned but named put as a terrorist group. I don't think it would basically end well in Iran, and we should see adjustments to Iran's policy.
Right, we'll have to obviously wait and watch on that. Stay with me both, Nina and Maral. Now, just after that announcement from President Donald Trump, the US Treasury has designated, as Maral was pointing out for us, that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are terrorists. He has slapped sanctions on them. The US has moved to impose those sanctions despite repeated warnings from Iran to the contrary. Right, let's go back to my colleagues Nina and of course Maral, who are both with us on the broadcast. Nina's in from Washington and Maral from Tehran, the two epicenters, so to speak, of this conversation right now. Nina, the reference to North Korea that President Trump made, obviously there's been so much conversation around his attitude and his rhetoric towards North Korea. Do you find that perhaps one of the reasons why this buck was sort of passed on was because President Trump has received such scathing reviews from many quarters on the way he's handled the entire North Korea crisis?
I think it's a very important point, and you're right to pick up on it. Iran and this accusation from President Trump that Iran is dealing with North Korea and that the US is not prepared to put up with that is part of the US's fear, I think, that Iran's claim that its ballistic missile program is not linked to its nuclear ambitions. The US, or certainly President Trump, does not believe that. So the sanctions that President Trump was talking about just then really pertain to these non-nuclear sanctions that the US feels empowered to impose, regardless of what happens to the international deal.
Right, and there are so many ironies to all of this, Nina, because one of the people who was part of this formation of this small-term fix, I don't know what else term to use right now for it, was Senator Corker, who's been involved in such a public spat with President Trump in so many ways. Does this in some ways sort of expose the kind of intricacies that are involved in the administration right now, with people pulling in different directions and President Trump tried to bring them under what he thinks is the right thing to do?
Yeah, the spat with Corker is absolutely indicative of some of the infighting that's been going on, both on Capitol Hill between.
Nina, I'm sorry, I have to come in at this point. The European Union is reacting to President Trump's speech. Let's listen in.
It is not a bilateral agreement. It does not belong to any single country, and it is not up to any single country to terminate it. It is a multilateral agreement which was unanimously endorsed by the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231. It is a robust deal that provides guarantees and a strong monitoring mechanism so that Iran's nuclear program is and will remain exclusively for civilian purposes only. We cannot afford, as international community, as Europe for sure, to dismantle a nuclear agreement that is working and delivering, especially now. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has verified 8 times that Iran is implementing all its nuclear-related commitments, following a comprehensive and strict monitoring system. There have been no violations of any of the commitments included in the agreement. The scope of the agreement relates to the nuclear program and is being fulfilled. The deal has prevented and continues to prevent, will continue to prevent, Iran from developing nuclear weapons. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action represents a key and functioning pillar of the international non-proliferation architecture that is even more important to preserve at a time of acute nuclear threat. We believe we have a collective responsibility to preserve it for our own collective security. The United States domestic process, and I underline domestic, following today's announcement of President Trump, is now in the hands of the United States Congress. The JCPOA is not a domestic issue, but a UN Security Council resolution. The international community and the European Union with it has clearly indicated that the deal is and will continue to be in place. The European Union continues to fully support the Iran nuclear deal and the full and strict implementation of all its provisions by all parties. The European Union, together with the rest of the international community, is committed to preserve it to the benefit of all, including the Iranian people.
Thank you very much. A couple of questions. Lawrence.
Thanks, Val. Lawrence Norman in the Wall Street Journal. Can I start with the question of whether Mr. Trump can terminate the deal? You just said he cannot. He just said he can. Which one of you is right? Can you explain that to us? And secondly, and crucially, if Mr. Tillerson comes to you in January or February after a change in the US law, if that happens, and says, let's work on a successor separate agreement dealing with ballistic missiles and sunsets in the agreement, or Mr. Trump will kill this deal, what will you say to him?
I just spoke to Secretary Tillerson, and that was not part of our conversation. I don't need to explain to you that know the deal very well. This deal is not a bilateral agreement. This is not an international treaty. This is an annex, a very long annex, to a UN Security Council resolution, unanimously adopted. To my knowledge, there's not one single country in the world that can terminate a UN Security Council resolution that has been adopted, even more so adopted unanimously and implemented.
All right, so the EU making its stance very clear, and another person who's made their stance very clear is the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has congratulated President Trump. He's backed him for his Iran strategy, which he announced just a short while ago. Now the European Union making it clear that it stands wholeheartedly behind the Iranian nuclear deal. Maral, that is the big question, isn't it? The one that the journalist posed to the representative from the EU, that can President Trump pull out of the US, of the Iranian nuclear deal, when in fact it is a multilateral deal. We've seen him try to do it with the Paris Climate Accord before, but there are more questions here than answers at this point in time.
Well, yes, but basically what's happening is that you see, like I was explaining, which determines a process solution. So I'm going to explain what happen if.
Maral, I'm sorry, we seem to be having trouble hearing you properly. We'll try and fix that audio connection with Maral and get back to her. In the meantime, let me go across to Nina, who's standing by in Washington, D.C. Nina, I mean, I can see why there is confusion over where exactly people are to stand when they're looking at the deal right now. And that question is rather valid, isn't it? Who does one believe right now, the President of the United States or the European Union?
Well, to some extent, the European Union. I mean, you heard in that robust reaction by the European Union to President Trump's assertion that he can sink the deal if he wants to, if Congress doesn't reach the conclusion that he wants. I mean, the European Union really can't do anything else. The European Union had an absolute stake, and I'm talking about the P1 permanent members of the UN Security Council +1 that were involved in the negotiating of this deal with Iran, the UN Security Council resolution. We heard just there that response that this is an international deal. This is not a US domestic deal. That there is no one single country that can unravel an international deal because it needs the consensus of all partners. The European Union had a stake in these negotiations with Iran. This international nuclear deal with Iran took years to come together. And really, I don't think Brussels or Germany and Berlin or the UK, they have any other choice except to defend the deal and let President Trump say his own thing. I mean, I think in the practical reality, the assessment that they're probably making right now is, well, he didn't go the full way. He didn't try to take some kind of executive action. This now has put the ball firmly in Congress's court, and I suspect that over the next 60 days we will see a flurry of activity and attempts by international allies to influence the outcome. But certainly President Trump's stance pits the US and Israel very firmly against their international allies, and I would say that we're on the edge of a precipice.
Absolutely, and it comes just a day after the US pulled out of UNESCO for its anti-Israel bias, so it seems to be following the path that we were expecting it to. We leave it at that. Nina, thanks very much for joining us here on WION and sharing your perspective with us. Maral is back with me on the broadcast as well. Maral, you were, of course, mentioning the fact that the one big takeaway that we can really count on as a given is President Trump's attitude towards the IRGC, and that is going to have huge implications back in Iran, won't it?
Yes, certainly. Please allow me just to go back to your previous question, because I think that's a very important matter. You see, if US is unhappy with the way that developments has unfolded, the way to go about it is that according to the United Nations Security Council resolution, they have to refer to joint commission or what's called the dispute resolution commission. And if the matter is not resolved, then there will be necessary to convene a meeting of foreign ministers of P5+1. And if the issue persists, then Security Council should decide if the sanctions should remain lifted or not. So now that we see that somehow United States and Mr. Trump, they have taken unilateral measures, it's somehow, I think, it shows that United States cannot be trusted as a reliable partner to make deals with, and this is certainly discouraging both international allies of United States and Iranian officials, as well as Iranian general public, to want to make concessions with Trump administration or U.S. government to renegotiate terms of Iran deal. Because what Mr. Trump just pointed out is that basically he will ask Congress, and this is a quote, to add clauses to JCPOA. And we know that both Iranian officials and also American allies mentioned that they have no intention of reopening the deal, and this is working the way it is. So it seems that United States basically putting more pressure on Iranian regime, and basically going about, and this announcement and this speech had several very provocative elements to it. For instance, somewhere Mr. Trump called Persian Gulf as Arab Gulf, and we know that both Iranian public and Iranian authorities are very sensitive towards that issue. So I think altogether it comes to basically be more of a provocative speech, and I don't see any legal backup from American allies in Europe, so it can be further implemented on an international level.
Fair enough. I have time for one more question, Maral, and that really is about the fact that on the one hand, President Trump might be alienating a number of countries by its stance on Iran, but at the same time, it also solidifies his relationship with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, and perhaps at this point in time, those relationships seem like they are more valuable to the President of the United States.
President Trump traveled to United Arab Emirates. They had more than $110 billion arms deal, and they are basically strengthening ties. But then again, I think during this process, Iran has also gained very good allies. I think within the past couple of months, especially European countries have shown great support for Iran, both during the Iran deal and also we witnessed that there was several summits happening within the past couple of months, economic summits in Switzerland for Iran. It was Iran's Iran-Europe summit, basically, and United Nations sent an envoy, basically Mrs. Helga Schmidt attended to show support for Iran. So I think it works both ways. It's not only that United States is benefiting from this process, but we shall see if within the next couple of months or years European countries' attitude will change or not.
Right, and let's see, even if the U.S. Congress agrees with President Trump's stance to start with. We leave it at that. Maral, thanks so much for being with us on the broadcast and sharing your perspective with us. Before we go any further, though, here's a look for our viewers who are tuning in right now at some of the key statements that President Trump made today while clarifying his stance on the Iranian nuclear deal.
The Iranian dictatorship's aggression continues to this day. The regime remains the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism and provides assistance to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Hezbollah, Hamas, and other terrorist networks. It develops, deploys, and proliferates missiles that threaten American troops and our allies. The regime's two favorite chants are death to America and death to Israel. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the United States and the United Nations Security Council sought over many years to stop Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons with a wide array of strong economic sanctions. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. The same mindset that produced this deal is responsible for years of terrible trade deals that have sacrificed so many millions of jobs in our country to the benefit of other countries.
And one of the first people to come out in support of President Trump's speech was Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This is what he said.
I congratulate President Trump for his courageous decision today. He boldly confronted Iran's terrorist regime. If the Iran deal is left unchanged, one thing is absolutely certain. In a few years' time, the world's foremost terrorist regime will have an arsenal of nuclear weapons, and that's a tremendous danger for our collective future. President Trump has just created an opportunity to fix this bad deal, to roll back Iran's aggression, and to confront its criminal support of terrorism. That's why Israel embraces this opportunity And that's why every responsible government and any person concerned with the peace and security of the world should do so as well.